We're going to cut our 3 widths of fabric now. And I've got my fabric laid out on my table. And I wanted to show you how I get this top edge squared off so that I have a nice straight cut. What I like to do is just to make a little cut and take one of the strings and pull it so that it makes a little bit of a mark. And then I can cut on that mark a little ways, and then I'll take the thread again and pull a little further on down and cut, going all the way across the fabric. I've got the top of my fabric squared off, and I'm ready to cut my widths of fabric for our drapery panels. One thing that I wanted to point out is that you always want to make sure you know which direction the pattern on your fabric is going if you do have a pattern fabric. Usually on the selvage you can see an arrow pointing up, and so then you know the top of the fabric is in this direction. And this is important because you don't want to make your drapery panels with the pattern upside down. And I also like to make sure that I pin at the top of each drapery panel in the upper right corner so that I know that my pattern is going this way and this is the top. So on each of my widths I'll be putting a pin in the top right corner. From our figures we came up with a cut of 50.5 for our pattern repeat. So I just marked at 50.5 on this side of the fabric and then on the other side, and drill a line straight across, and then this is what I'll be cutting on to cut my first width of fabric. Then I'll go to the second width and do the same, and then the third. Making sure again that I put a pin in the upper right hand corner of each of the cuts. We've got our 3 cuts of fabric cut, and I've put a pin in the upper right hand corner of each of our cuts. On this third cut, because we need 1.5 widths for each panel, we're going to cut this third cut in half. So I also marked the top of the middle of the panel so that after I cut it, I know that this is the top. If you have draper panels that are just 1 width, or if you have 2 widths or 3 widths, whole widths, then just disregard this step. This is only if you have a half a width in your panel. So on this third cut, I'm going to take the other edge and fold over. Line up our selvages, get it straightened out, and then I'm going to iron the fabric real quick where the fold is, and then simply cut the width in half along that fold line. You don't have to iron the fold. I just think it helps a little bit, makes it a little bit easier for me to find where to cut. Okay, so now we've got 2 full widths and we've got 1 width that is cut in half. Now this is kind of a tricky part, so I want to make sure I go over it clearly. We want to put our half widths with our full width so that we can seam them together. But we want to make sure that the half widths go on the outside of each drapery panel. So this width that's folded over, I'm going to put on this side. I'm going to get this other cut out of our way for a minute. So this half width, and this is the top, you can see my pin, is going to come on this side and get pinned so that our half width will be on the left side of the left panel. So this one is going to have to go on the other side of this whole width, so that when I hold it up, this is the right panel and the half width is on the outside of the panel. I'm going to pin this one also. In this next step, we're going to seam our fabric widths together. And I'm going to show you how to match up the pattern if you have a pattern fabric. If you only have one width of fabric in your drapery panels, then you can skip this step and go on to hemming the bottom of your drapery panels. If you have a solid fabric, you can skip the step where I talk about matching the pattern and just sew your seams together. So I've got my half width of fabric and my whole width, and I've ironed under part of the selvage in order for me to match it up to the other 1 width piece of fabric. So I'm going to bring the fabric over. To get our patterns matched up, I'm going to lay my half width that has the folded under selvage and lay it on the full width, matching up the pattern. I'm going to put a pin in the fabric just to hold the fabrics in place as I'm matching. And I'm going to continue doing this all the way down the length of the fabric. Now that I've got my fabric pinned in place, I'm going to glue baste it so that it will stay in place when I take it over to the sewing machine. So just using some fabric glue, I'm just going to make a few dots and then put the fabric down where it needs to be to match up the pattern. And I'm going to put the pin back in. Then I'm going to continue on down the next section, doing more glue basting, setting it down and putting the pin back in. And I'm going to continue going on down the panel with my glue basting, and then I'm going to iron it very lightly to help set the glue so it'll dry a little faster. Once your glue has set for a little bit, take the pins out and then flip your fabric over so that you can see the ironed portion of your seam. We're going to pin the seam, and then we're going to take the fabric over to the sewing machine and sew our seam. At the sewing machine, we're going to stitch right where we've ironed. You can see the crease. I'm going to sew right in that crease line to make our seam. Making sure to stop when I get to a pin. And I'll continue on down the length of the fabric. You can see by glue basting and then sewing the seam, we've matched up the pattern for the seam pretty well. Ordinarily, when I sew 2 pieces of fabric together and make a seam, I like to open the seam up and then iron it open. But because I did the glue basting to help match the pattern, if I open the seam up now, I'm going to be ironing on the glue. So what I like to do when I glue baste a seam together is just fold the seam over both sides to one side of the panel and just iron it that way.